So by the standards of a lot of the speakers that we've had this year, Inge's almost new to SHA, having only been here for 5 years now. I think we've had quite a lot of people lately who've been at SHA sort of since it began or something like that. So you're practically the new kid in town, having only been here 5 years, which is a pretty long time. So Inge joined SHA as a research fellow in the Sheffield Alcohol Research Group. But she's now a lecturer, and as I say, she's also the Deputy Programme Lead for our Europub Health Programme. Her background's in Psychology and Behavioural Science, and she has a PhD in Psychology from the University of Liverpool. And most of her research is around alcohol and alcohol serving size, but also around the stigma around weight as well. So at that point, I will switch to your slide, Inge, and hand over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you everyone for being here. It's very exciting that I get to have almost a whole hour to talk about the research I've been doing on alcohol serving sizes. I've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to go straight into it after I've thanked the Society for the Study of Addiction. Most of the research I'll be talking about has been funded by a fellowship from the Society for the Study of Addiction, and I'm particularly grateful for Matt Field and Petra Meyer for being excellent supervisors on the fellowship. I'm sure a lot of you who are on this call are aware of this, but alcohol consumption is harmful to our health, and this costs the NHS and UK society quite a lot of money every year. For those who are unaware, the UK Chief Medical Officer recommends that to have low risks of alcohol-related harms, you should not exceed 14 units per week. So that is approximately 7 pints of beer, 7 large glasses of wine, or 14 single measures of spirits. And around a quarter of adults in the UK regularly exceed these guidelines. In the context of the harms from alcohol and higher risk drinking, even small reductions in alcohol consumption across the populations can result in large public health gains. But it's hard to change behavior. As a behavioral scientist, I'm sort of the key person to know this. 20% of those who drink at hazardous or harmful levels try to cut down, but most of those are unsuccessful. And across a bunch of research, we really show that motivation is insufficient to change behavior. And that means that we need interventions to reduce alcohol consumptions that don't rely on individuals to do the hard work of getting motivated and making all the changes themselves. And instead, we need interventions that help us make better choices without having to put the effort in. The theoretical underpinning around this work lies in choice architecture. The underlying idea is that our behavior is partially informed by heuristics or rules of thumbs and biases. We do that to make our own decision-making more efficient. And our immediate environment, so the things we see around us, influence which products we might select, purchase, and consume. And therefore, if we change our immediate environment, we can make certain choices easier and more appealing. And in particular, we're interested in making healthier choices easier and more appealing. The research that I'm going to be talking about looks at the serving size of alcohol, and this is preceded by a large literature base that looks at the effect of food portion sizes on consumption. And it's a very robust finding that larger portions lead to greater energy intake, both among people and among non-human animals. Our research also shows that if we expose people to smaller portions, that this changes what they think a normal portion size is and therefore reduces the total energy intake. So this might mean that if we can translate these findings to smaller alcoholic drinks, that this might lead to reduced consumptions both immediately when we serve people smaller drinks, but also in the long term by changing what is considered to be a normal serving size. However, alcohol is not food, it's consumed in very many different ways. And it's unclear whether drinkers would compensate for these differences. So the first study I'm going to be talking about is research that we conducted in the University of Liverpool about 5 years ago, and that's really when the first literature around the effect of serving size, alcoholic serving size on alcohol consumption has come out. So we conducted 2 experimental studies to look at what would happen if we reduce the standard serving size of alcoholic drinks both in a laboratory setting and in a field experiment. So the first study was a laboratory setting, which means we invited people to a laboratory that was made to look like a living room, where people could drink unlimited drinks for 1 hour, and we either served them standard size drinks or smaller size drinks. The drinks were reduced in size by 25%. And our results show that if participants were served smaller drinks, that they on average drank 21% less alcohol, which suggests that people do not compensate for a reduction in alcohol serving size by ordering more drinks, and therefore they end up drinking fewer alcohol units in the session. We then followed on this study with a field experiment. We hired out the function room in a local bar and ran multiple pub quiz nights. On some of the nights we served standard sized alcohol, so pints of beer and cider and medium glasses of wine. And on other nights we served smaller alcoholic drinks. And in our case it was 2/3 pints of beer and cider and small glasses of wine. So this roughly represents a 30% reduction across the alcohol served. And again, our results show that over the course of a whole evening, people drank on average 40% less alcohol on nights that we served smaller drinks compared to nights that we served standard size drinks. We then used alcohol policy modeling to do an estimation of what would happen if we implemented a serving size reduction across the UK. So on the graph on the slide, you can see the number of alcohol-related deaths per year that would happen if there was no policy change. And then we have 4 scenarios that look at the reduction of alcohol-related deaths under different serving size policies. So we estimated the effect of a 25% reduction in the serving size of all entree drinks, so all drinks that were served in bars, restaurants, pubs. And we looked both at more conservative estimates, and even the most conservative estimate would result in quite a substantial reduction in the number of alcohol-related deaths per year. Similar research has since been conducted on the effect of wine bottle size on home consumption, and this also shows that if people were given smaller wine bottles, they drank less wine overall than if they were given standard size wine bottles. So it seems that there is a strong case emerging for reducing the standard serving size of alcohol across the market. However, this is quite a difficult thing in practice, and there are several policy options that you could conceive of to try to reduce either the serving sizes that people are given or potentially reduce the serving sizes of drinks that people choose. So a very restrictive form of this policy might be to actually remove the largest servings from the market altogether, or cap a serving size based on a drink strength, so basically just eliminate the largest portions. But there are also less restrictive policies that you can consider that are more reliant on increasing the appeal of smaller sizes or reducing the appeal of larger sizes to be effective. I'm going to be talking about 4 of those policies. So these are enforcing proportional pricing, increasing the availability of smaller sizes, norms messaging, and personalized serving size recommendations. So the first policy I want to be talking about is proportional pricing. The idea behind this research is that drinkers choose alcoholic drinks largely due to their price. And in the UK, larger products have a better value for money than smaller products. What I mean by that is that the price per litre for the larger products is smaller than the price per litre for smaller products. So that means that effectively the larger alcohol is cheaper per unit than the smallest alcohol. And drinkers in interviews have shared that this is why they choose larger products, and also why they are reluctant to switch to smaller products if they had the option. One possible way to reduce this appeal for larger products based on their price is to enforce a flat price per litre for all sizes of a specific brand. And you can see from the prices on the screen that this would result in a substantial price increase for the large products of this particular brand, and therefore is likely to reduce the appeal of this product that's based on the price. There's some promising results on the effect of proportional pricing on the selection of smaller serving sizes of food. And there's also some research on the effectiveness of a ban on multi-pack deals, so effectively banning better value for money deals based on buying multiple products of the same brand, reducing alcohol sales. So we wanted to test the effect of proportional pricing on how much alcohol participants would purchase in a hypothetical purchasing task. And I'm going to walk you through this task and explain the different components. So this is an online experiment where people were given two brands on the screen with two sizes. So you can see here on the left, there we have Budweiser, both in a large size and then a smaller size, and Kronenbourg in a larger size and a smaller size. And these were the choice options participants were given. They were asked how many of each of the products on screen they would buy. And then we measured how much alcohol they ended up purchasing from this choice and what the proportion of alcohol that was purchased from smaller products, to try to understand whether if people purchased less alcohol in total, whether this was due to people switching away from larger products to choosing smaller products, or reducing the number of products overall. We did this experiment both in a lager version, a vodka version, and a wine version. The experiments work the same for all three of the drink types, so I'm going to talk you through it specifically for the lager version. So it's an experimental setup, which means that we present exactly the same trial, with the only difference being whether or not standard pricing applies or proportional pricing applies. So you can see here on the left that is standard pricing, which means that the relative price for large drinks is smaller than the relative price for smaller drinks. And on the right-hand side, we've made the price per litre for the large drinks the same as the price per litre for the smaller drinks, which means that their price has increased. We did this in total 30 times of the same trial, which were presented both in the proportional pricing and standard pricing condition, which means participants were asked to make these choices in total 60 times in a randomized order, which allows us to draw causal conclusions about the effect of proportional pricing on alcohol purchasing and possible switching. Please raise your hand or put a message in the chat if that is unclear, but I will move on otherwise. In total, 207 participants took part in this study, and they were assigned to either a lager, wine, or vodka version based on what they said they regularly consumed. We used quota sampling to get a broadly representative sample of the UK based on gender and household income. However, our results showed that 65% of participants were classed as hazardous or harmful drinkers. And if you think back to my first slide where I showed that only 25% of the UK consumed above the low-risk drinking guidelines, this means that our sample is made up of much more hazardous drinking than the general population. The demographics for the different drink types were similar except for gender, with more men who consumed lager and more women who consumed wine. Okay, so does proportional pricing encourage switching? So on the graph on the slide here, I've got the proportion of alcohol units that were purchased from small products on the y-axis, and then whether drinkers were classed as low-risk drinkers or hazardous drinkers on the x-axis. And the bars you see on the slide now are on the standard pricing condition. So you can see that broadly, low-risk drinkers and hazardous drinkers purchase a similar proportion of their units from small products. And after we apply proportional pricing, this increases to a much higher percentage, which shows that people do partially switch from larger products to smaller products after proportional pricing is in place. I'm showing you the graph for all drink types taken together, but this pattern also is shown for each drink type separately. And does that then mean that proportional pricing also leads to a reduction in the amount of UK units purchased? So again, on the x-axis, we've got low-risk drinkers and hazardous drinkers, and now on the y-axis, we have the total amount of alcohol purchased on each trial in UK units. And as you can see here, consistently hazardous drinkers purchase more alcohol than lighter drinkers, and that is exactly what we would expect. But there is a mixed picture when it comes to the effect of proportional pricing on alcohol purchasing for the different drink types. So as you can see here, there's no difference between the amount of alcohol purchased under standard pricing compared to proportional pricing for lager drinkers. We see a reduction among wine consumers, and this is moderated by hazardous drinking, which shows that this effect is stronger for hazardous drinkers than for lower risk drinkers. And you can see here that there's quite a substantial effect reduction for vodka consumers, and this is not moderated by lighter or heaviest drinkers, so this means it's the same for drinker risk categories. So it's a complicated picture, and it looks like there are differences in drink type on whether or not proportional pricing is effective. So there are two possible explanations for this difference between the drink types. So firstly, I want to talk about the absolute price difference between standard pricing and proportional pricing, as this differs substantially between lager, wine and vodka. I've shown on the screen the mean increase in the price for the products under proportional pricing compared to standard pricing. And for lager, you can see that is 23 pence, whereas for wine and vodka, this is a much more substantial price increase. On the right-hand side, you see a graph that looks at the association between the price change and the difference in alcohol purchased on the proportional pricing trials compared to the standard pricing trials. And you can see that I have to really zoom in to even be able to see the line for lager. And even though this is a significant association, we are probably not powered to detect a 25%, this small reduction in alcohol purchasing across our trials. So partially the absolute price difference might explain some of the lack of effect for lager. Another explanation might be that lager is typically sold in multi-packs, whereas we presented drinks in single products only. However, we followed up this experiment with an experiment where we did look at lager purchasing from multi-packs, and we still don't see an overall effect of the amount of alcohol purchased under proportional pricing. The only difference we see is if lager is purchased in multi-packs of the same size but different quantities, and that is more alike to the multi-pack ban that I talked about earlier, and it's not really related to serving size changes. So multi-packs are unlikely to be the full explanation for the different drink types. So our conclusions from this study is that proportional pricing leads to partial switching from larger to smaller products, and it leads to reduced alcohol purchasing for wine, vodka, and some lager multi-packs. And it's likely that the absolute price increase is important for effectiveness. However, we don't know whether switching alone would be enough to result in reduced consumption in the absence of reduced purchasing. So it's quite likely that if this is not the case, that a proportional pricing intervention would only be effective for those more expensive products like wine and vodka. And it is also unclear how this policy might affect health inequalities based on who drinks which types of drinks, and this is not something that we've looked at. The next policy I want to talk about is increasing the availability of smaller sizes. This is a policy that is quite an appealing policy, as it does not reduce anyone's choice, but it is increasing people's choice to purchase smaller products if they want to. This is a study conducted by people from the University of Cambridge, and they looked at the impact of adding a middle serving size of beer and cider to the offer in pubs and bars. The rationale for this is that interventions that restrict options, such as removing the larger size of a serving size from the market, might evoke opposition from both the industry and the public. And there is some research from the food literature that shows that adding smaller portion sizes to the existing offer in restaurants and shops reduces energy intake. So it's possible that just by this smaller serving size being available in a bar or restaurant, this would nudge some people to selecting a smaller serving size and therefore drinking less. The researchers used an ABA reversal design in real pubs and bars, and what that means is that during sort of a normal time period, the bars offered the normal size options that were on offer. Then they switched to an intervention period, which is called the B period, where they added 2/3 of a pint to the offer, and then they reversed back to the normal size option. And the researchers collected data on alcohol sales throughout all those 3 periods, and then compared total sales during the normal size option versus the additional middle size time. Sorry, I hope that makes sense. Their results showed that there's no significant difference in the total amount of alcohol beer and cider sold during the time that the 2/3 pint option was available or not. And they also showed that very few units of the 2/3 pints were actually sold. And this might suggest that people were unaware of the serving size being available in the first place, and it might therefore need more than just adding to the market to be able to be effective. It's also possible that some people may have switched down from a pint to 2/3 of a pint, and others may have switched up from half a pint or 1/3 of a pint up to 2/3 of a pint, and this might have cancelled each other out as well. The researchers did not evaluate whether the new size was promoted, and that might be very necessary to change people's consumption habits and norms in bars to be able to shift people's consumption. Norms are, in general, a possible way in which we might shift people's consumption, again, without having to resort to interventions that might evoke opposition. And there are, to the best of my knowledge, no studies that have evaluated the effect of norms messaging in the context of serving size. However, I have conducted 2 studies that sort of do the preliminary work for looking at norms messages, and I want to share the implications of them here. So I'm going to again take you back to the food literature and talk about the norm range model. The norm range model posits that there's a range of serving sizes or portion sizes that we might consider to be normal, and that there are foods that exist on the market that are larger than a normal portion, and there are foods that are smaller than a normal portion. And whether or not a food is within the range that we consider to be normal affects our consumption. So if a food is larger than normal, we might consume fewer items of that food, or we might consume a smaller portion of it, might want to share it with people. If foods are within the norm range, we probably are consuming a similar number of those items, and size changes within the norm range might therefore result in reductions in food intake. And whereas if a food is so small that it's considered to be too small to be normal, then we might compensate for that change by increasing the number of items we consume. So the norm range model suggests that the only point at which portion size reductions lead to reductions in energy intake is if they are within the norm range and not if they cross the boundary from a large food to a normal sized food or a normal sized food to a small food. We don't know yet to what extent this norm range model applies to alcohol serving sizes, and it's important for us to understand that, because to make norms messaging effective, we need to both understand to what extent serving sizes are normative, to what extent people actually have norms around these drinks, and also to what extent those serving size norms are associated with drinking. So like I said, I've done 2 studies that get at this. So the first one was I looked at how product characteristics affects people's perception on whether a product that's on the screen contains either a single or multiple drinks. So this looks at this top norm boundary where people where products might be so large that they're not considered to be containing a single drink anymore, and they might be considered for use for sharing or for having multiple drinks out of. And I looked at how product size, strength, container type, and drink type affected whether or not a product was classified to contain a single or multiple drink. And I also wanted to find out what the threshold was at which a drink becomes so large that it's considered to be a single drink, too large to be considered a single drink. So 100 participants who were, again, I used a quota sample to recruit participants that was broadly representative of the UK population of alcohol consumers. And they rated a random subset of 250 alcohol products that ranged in the brand, the size, and the strength on whether they contained one drink or more than one drink. And then we used logistic regressions and receiver operating curve characteristics analysis to understand how drink characteristic influenced whether or not the drink was considered to contain a single or multiple drinks, and where the thresholds lie. So our results show that larger products, stronger products that in total contain more alcohol, and bottled products were more likely to be classed as containing multiple drinks compared to smaller, weaker, and cans. And there was no meaningful interaction with hazardous drinking, which suggests that this is a normative perception rather than a perception based on individuals' habitual drinking. And the receiver operating curve characteristics analysis showed that for different drink types, there were different thresholds at which a drink becomes so large that it's not considered a single drink anymore. I've put the thresholds on screen here. So for beer, it's after a pint, drinks are considered to be too large. For cider, it's 500 milliliters. For ready-to-drink drinks, so these are pre-mixed cocktails or alcopops, it's 440 milliliters. For wine, we're looking at 200 milliliters. And then for spirits, we're looking at 50 milliliters. Then I've done a similar study, not looking at packaged alcohol, but at the norms around the serving size of alcohol in a glass. We created a possible questionnaire to measure the extent to which someone had a higher or a lower serving size norm perception. And we tested the validity and reliability of this measure and analyzed which serving sizes are considered to be normal to be consumed as a single drink. So we did this by showing participants a range of different fullness levels of wine, beer, cider, and spirits. And we asked them to rate all serving sizes that they considered to be normal. So this is in line with the norm range model. We assume that people have multiple serving sizes that they would consider to be normal. A quota sample of 500 participants completed this measure. And our analyses showed that this measure had acceptable internal consistency, and that scores on this measure were correlated with intended consumption and measures of hazardous drinking. So this suggests that this measure does, to some extent, measure serving size norms. And the general scale had better psychometric properties than a personalized scale, which again suggests that this is a reflection of norms rather than individuals' habits of alcohol consumption. And then on the slide here, I've got a graph that shows which level of fullness on those 8 glasses that I showed you early people consider to rate to be normal, a normal serving size. There are 2 things I want you to pay attention to here. Firstly, beer and cider are almost exactly the same in this measure, so there is very little difference between them. And the second thing I want you to notice that is there's not a single serving size that is considered to be normal by everyone. So there's likely to be large variations between individuals' perception of what is a normal serving size. So taken together, those 2 studies suggest that the norm range model may be applied to alcohol, that there's not a single serving size or packaging size that is universally considered to be normal or a single drink, and this lends some credence to using the norm range model. It's important to understand that these norm measures and the thresholds may not generalize to other countries. The UK has their own norms around sort of drinking in general, and we might not see the same effects if we were to do this study in a country that used different serving sizes. And it is not yet clear to what extent norm perceptions may affect alcohol consumption. However, one of the useful things around creating a norm measure like this is that we can use this for early testing of interventions around norm messaging to see if they shift people's perception of what a normal serving size is before having to do in-person or testing on alcohol consumption. Then the final possible intervention I want to talk about is telling people to reduce their own serving sizes to reduce drinking. The rationale behind this is that it's very common for people to give and receive advice on how to reduce drinking. It is likely to be the most socially acceptable intervention from all the ones that I've presented today. And the NHS already suggests that people reduce their serving size to reduce drinking. However, after having spoken to people in interviews and sort of in general throughout my fellowship, people are very uncertain about how they should go about implementing this advice. So we conducted an experiment to look at the effect of supplementing the standard NHS advice with detailed advice on how people might go about reducing their serving size, with giving recommended swaps, suggestions on where they might find products, and suggestions on how they might go about changing glass sizes or self-pour servings in the home. We recruited 210 people who were drinking at hazardous or harmful levels, who were motivated to reduce drinking over a 4-week period. The study took 4 weeks in total. We asked participants to complete weekly drinking diaries in which we took detailed measures of exactly what drinks they consumed, including what serving size those drinks were. We conducted the norms measure at baseline and 4-week follow-up, and we also did follow-up interviews with 12 participants from the intervention group. So I'm going to present you first the results from the manipulation check. So we wanted to see whether participants actually took on board the advice we gave them. And the results showed that participants in the intervention arm were more likely, compared to the control arm, to remember that we've advised them to reduce their serving size, and that they reported drinking smaller drinks and purchasing smaller drinks throughout the intervention. So this suggests that our manipulation was successful. However, we don't see any difference between the effect of our supplementary advice compared to the NHS advice on total alcohol consumption across the 4-week period. As you can see on this graph, everyone reduced their alcohol consumption compared to baseline, and this was no different for participants in the intervention group compared to the control group. The detailed drinking diaries also allowed us to look at what serving sizes participants actually reported drinking during the study. And as you can see here, there was no actual difference in the serving size participants consumed over the intervention week compared to baseline, which suggests that even though they were self-reported trying to drink smaller drinks, they probably did not actually succeed in drinking these drinks. The interviews highlighted several barriers for participants on how to reducing their own serving sizes. One of the main barriers was the lack of access or availability of smaller choices. And participants shared how their preferred brand didn't have a smaller option for them to consume. They didn't have smaller glassware in their house, or the pubs or bars that they went to did not have smaller glassware available. And they talked about how the smaller products were expensive and therefore this was prohibitive for them to swap from larger products to smaller products. Some participants also found that the reductions in serving size caused them to drink more and therefore they stopped reducing their serving size. There were two key themes around this. So some participants talked about having to place their bottle of wine nearer to them when they were drinking because they had to refill their glass more often, whereas normally they would have had to go back to the kitchen to get a refill, and they found themselves refilling more often and therefore drinking more. And other people talked about how they didn't feel satisfied after having a smaller drink and therefore wanted to drink more to compensate for that. People also just discussed how it was difficult to remember to drink smaller drinks after a few drinks, and this might reflect that people might need more time to really form a habit. And finally, there were quite a few people who discussed concerns about others' perceptions about them not having a proper drink. So they talked about being worried that they might be mocked by their peers, and several participants described situations where either a friend or a stranger had sort of forced a normal sized drink onto them and bought them a drink to drink. Some things that facilitated reducing the serving size were having people who were in the same boat and sort of keeping each other accountable, but also if you were consuming drinks in a setting where other people were also deviating from the norm. So if the participants described that if they were consuming alcohol around people who were having alcohol-free drinks or soft drinks, that they felt more comfortable ordering a smaller drink than if they were in a group where everyone was drinking the same thing. So our conclusions from this study are that supplementing NHS advice with detailed advice to reduce serving sizes does not lead to greater reductions in alcohol consumption compared to receiving the NHS advice on its own. And it's important to keep in mind that this was in a motivated sample. So these differences might be even less pronounced in a sample that is not motivated to try to implement this intervention. Well, we're coming to the end of my talk, so I just want to share some overall reflections and go back to this list of possible policy options. So based on the literature to date, there is evidence that would suggest the top two options might be effective in reducing population level alcohol consumption, but because these are policy options that remove choice, they are likely to lead to resistance among industry or among the population. Increasing the appeal of smaller sizes or reducing the appeal of larger sizes might be effective in some ways. So for example, we might expect proportional pricing to lead to some benefits. However, overall, there doesn't seem to be as strong evidence to implement policies like this, and they might need to be supplemented by stronger enforcement or action. There are important barriers to reducing the serving size of your drink by yourself, and all of this, in my opinion, would point to that serving size related intervention may need to be imposed on people to be effective rather than need to be self-directed or nudged. So I think that's it for me. I would love to hear any questions or comments. I've not been looking at the chat, so I will have a quick look there. But I think everyone can raise their hand now if you want to ask any questions or put them in the chat.